The cold Kentucky wind swept through the open fields of Lexington, rattling the wooden stable doors like a warning. It was auction day, one of the most prestigious horse events in the South. Wealthy breeders, sharp-eyed investors, and seasoned horsemen gathered near the show ring, laughing over steaming cups of coffee, dressed in fine wool coats and pressed slacks. Among them walked a man who didn't belong. George Lyman, 68, wore a weathered fedora, a tweed blazer that had seen better days, and carried in his eyes the heavy silence of someone who had outlived too much. 2 decades had passed since George had disappeared from the equestrian world, following the tragic death of his wife, Margaret, during a show-jumping accident. She was riding a horse George had trained with his own hands. After the funeral, he vanished, sold their land, cut off ties, and retreated into the hills of Berea with a few horses and too many ghosts. Most believed he'd gone mad. Some swore he had died. No one expected to see him again, especially not leading a magnificent black Friesian stallion into the ring. The stallion was unlike anything the crowd had seen in years. His obsidian coat gleamed even under the overcast sky, and his thick mane danced in the wind like silk. The red saddle blanket on his back looked hand-stitched, and the rosette on his chest, a first-place ribbon from a small-town competition, was barely acknowledged by the smug crowd. Snickers spread through the group. "Is that Lyman?" someone whispered. "Did he bring a parade horse to an elite auction?" George heard the laughter. He kept walking. When they reached the center of the ring, he gently let go of the lead rope. The Friesian rose on his hind legs without hesitation, rearing with absolute balance and power. A gasp spread through the spectators. The horse held the pose for a second longer than expected, then lowered himself gracefully, without a single command. George hadn't moved. He simply looked up at the stallion with eyes full of memory and pain. For a moment, no one spoke. One man dropped his coffee. Another stared, mouth slightly open, at the horse standing so calmly beside a man they all had dismissed. There was no showmanship, no tricks, just something deeper. A connection. A story none of them knew. And as George whispered something to the Friesian, barely audible over the wind, it became clear. This was not just a horse. And George Lyman had not come here to be forgotten. The crowd was still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The black Friesian, now calm and poised beside George, stood like a statue carved from midnight. The air was heavy, not with awe, but confusion. No one knew what to say. This wasn't a flashy performance or a gimmick. It was something raw, something that demanded silence. And that silence made some people uncomfortable. From the back of the crowd, Dean Whitmore, one of the auction's most respected breeders, narrowed his eyes. "That's no ordinary horse," he muttered to the man next to him. "That's trained, but not the way we do it." Dean had been in the business for 40 years, but he couldn't read the Friesian's body language. That unsettled him more than he liked to admit. What unnerved him even more was George. How calm he was, how disconnected from the noise around him, as if this moment was never about the auction at all. Back near the stable doors, a younger handler named Ryan Burke couldn't take his eyes off the scene. He'd grown up hearing rumors about George Lyman, the recluse who once trained horses so well they were said to move on voice alone. Ryan had always thought it was folklore, old cowboy talk. But now, watching George with the Friesian, something stirred in him. There was a look in that stallion's eyes, almost human. And George looked like a man who had been through hell and walked back with something no one else could touch. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "This isn't a circus," barked Wes Hanley, the auction coordinator, a bulky man with a clipboard and a bruised ego. "We don't have time for theatrics." He was embarrassed. His event had just been upstaged by someone who didn't even RSVP. George turned his head slowly toward Wes, his expression unreadable. For a second, it looked like he might speak. But he didn't. Instead, He gently ran his hand along the horse's neck and began to walk away. "Where are you going, Lyman?" someone called out. "You just gonna spook us and leave?" George didn't respond. He led the Friesian through the crowd, parting them without force, just presence. The same people who laughed earlier now stepped aside like schoolboys in church. One woman reached out and touched the horse's side, whispering, "It's like he knows." As George disappeared into the shadows of the barns, murmurs began to swell behind him. Who was this horse? Where had he been trained? And more importantly, what happened to George Lyman during those 20 silent years? That night, as the barns quieted and the buzz of the auction faded into distant memory, George sat alone, leaning against a wooden post in the back lot. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't seem to notice. The Friesian stood a few feet away, grazing calmly under the moonlight. George watched him, the way a father might watch a sleeping child, protective, burdened, and endlessly lost in thought. This horse wasn't just an animal to him. He was a living piece of something George had buried deep, a part of the past clawing its way back into the light. 20 years alone in the Appalachian foothills hadn't made George bitter. They had made him still. After Margaret's death, the world had stopped making sense. Their dream ranch, once full of laughter, music, and students learning the art of horsemanship, had become silent. He couldn't bear the sound of hooves without seeing her fall. But he didn't sell everything. He couldn't. He kept a few horses, orphans, rejects, the forgotten, and poured himself into them, not to win ribbons, but to survive. And then came Shadow, a jet-black colt with a scar above his eye and a soul too wild for most hands. Found abandoned in the woods by a neighbor's nephew, Shadow was malnourished, defensive, and unpredictable. But George saw something else in him. Grief, maybe. Or rage. The same kind he saw every time he looked in the mirror. "You ain't broken," George had whispered the first night he brought him home. "You're just hurt. Like me." That was the start. Training Shadow wasn't about discipline. It was about trust. George didn't use whips or loud commands. He spoke softly, moved slowly, and waited. Days, weeks, months. Until one day, Shadow walked toward him on his own. From that moment, they were inseparable. George never thought about returning to the public eye. But then, earlier that month, he got a letter from an old friend, someone from the old world. A note scribbled in shaky pen. "They've forgotten what real horses can be, George. Come show them. One last time." Now, under the stars, George opened that same letter again, folded in his coat pocket. The ink had smudged from the sweat of his hands. He read the words again, as if hoping they'd mean something different now. But they didn't. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about reclaiming something lost, not from others, but from himself. Behind the barns, unseen by George, Dean Whitmore watched from a distance, eyes narrowed. He recognized the horse now. And if he was right, then George Lyman wasn't just a forgotten trainer. He was hiding something that could shatter everything. The next morning, the auction grounds buzzed with whispers. Word had spread fast about the mysterious horse and the man who walked in from nowhere. George Lyman was now the subject of more than just curiosity. He was becoming a problem. Some thought he was trying to embarrass the organizers. Others feared he might stir a change in an industry too set in its ways. But one man wasn't interested in gossip. Dean Whitmore was digging for facts. Dean had spent most of the night sifting through old records and notes from past auctions. He had seen that horse before. Or one just like it. But it didn't make sense. The horse George called Shadow shouldn't exist. Not with those bloodlines. Not with that control. Unless... Dean's eyes stopped on a faded photo from 15 years ago. A rare Friesian stallion, part of a controversial breeding experiment that was shut down after accusations of mistreatment and mishandling. The program was supposedly dissolved. The horses, sold or put down. But Dean knew better. Some secrets don't die, they just disappear into the hills. Back at the stables, George was brushing Shadow in silence. The two hadn't slept. There was a tension in the air now, something neither man nor animal could ignore. Shadow's ears twitched constantly, his head lifting every few minutes to scan the surroundings. George could feel it too, they were being watched. He had known this moment would come. That stepping back into the world meant stepping into its judgment. But he didn't do this for glory. He did it for the promise he made to Margaret. If they ever forget what these creatures truly are, I'll remind them. That promise had cost him everything. Shadow wasn't supposed to be his. He had rescued the colt from a breeder going bankrupt, paid in cash, no paperwork. The man made George swear he'd never bring the horse to the public. But after years of silence and seeing what the auction world had become, cold, mechanical, all flash and no soul, George couldn't stay away. He needed people to remember. Horses weren't trophies. They were living, feeling beings. Shadow was proof of that. Just as George finished tightening the saddle, a voice startled him. "You should have stayed gone, Lyman." Dean Whitmore stood by the stall door, arms crossed, eyes hard. George didn't respond right away. He just looked at Shadow, then back at Dean. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Dean stepped closer. "I want to know where you got that horse. Because if it's who I think it is, you're in deeper trouble than you know." George didn't flinch. He looked Dean Whitmore in the eye, not with defiance, but with the steady, quiet strength of a man who had nothing left to fear. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the words came out heavier than he'd intended. Shadow shifted behind him, sensing the tension. George placed a calming hand on the stallion's neck, more for himself than for the horse. Dean took a step closer. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. That horse, he's not just rare. He's government property. Or he was. That stallion came out of the Breckinridge program. The one shut down after the scandal. They were tracking bloodlines, temperament, neurological response. Most of those horses didn't make it past year 2. But one showed potential beyond anything they'd ever seen. And then it vanished." George's throat tightened. He had spent years praying that part of Shadow's origin would stay buried. The man he'd bought him from had been desperate, paranoid, and half-drunk, but his fear had been real. "They'll come for him if they find out," he'd said. George hadn't believed him back then. But now, with Dean standing here, the weight of that warning crushed down all over again. "So what?" George muttered. "You going to call the feds on an old man?" Dean didn't answer right away. He looked at Shadow, not with greed, but with caution, maybe even fear. "You don't understand what they were trying to build, George. That horse was part of something bigger. Something not meant to be in public hands. Whatever bond you think you've got, it won't matter if they decide he's a threat." He leaned in. "You think this is just about bloodlines and auction shows? Wake up. You brought a classified animal into a public space. That's not just risky, it's dangerous." The words echoed in George's chest like a distant gunshot. He had come back to remind people what true horsemanship looked like, to honor Margaret's legacy. But now it felt like he had dragged Shadow into something he couldn't protect him from. His jaw clenched. "He's not a weapon," George said quietly. "He's a survivor. Just like me." Dean sighed and stepped back, conflicted. "You're going to have to make a choice, George. Keep showing that horse, or keep him safe. You can't have both." As Dean walked away, George turned to Shadow, who stood silently watching him, ears tilted forward as if he understood every word. And deep inside, George knew, this wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about sacrifice. George didn't sleep that night. He sat in the hay beside Shadow's stall, arms resting on his knees, eyes staring into the darkness. The words Dean had spoken kept echoing in his mind. "You can't have both." Over and over again, like a warning bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He could still feel the old pain in his chest, not physical, but something deeper. The kind of ache that only comes when everything you've loved has been taken once before. Shadow nudged his shoulder gently in the quiet of the barn, as if sensing the weight in George's heart. He had always known when something was wrong. That was what made him different. Not just his training, not his bloodlines, but the way he connected. Like he carried a soul that had lived through loss too. George ran a hand along the Friesian's mane, his fingers slow and deliberate. "You were never meant for a cage," he whispered, "and I'm not about to let them put you in one." But even as he spoke those words, doubt crawled in like a chill. If what Dean said was true, it was only a matter of time before someone bigger came looking. The auction had eyes everywhere. Cameras. Lists. He hadn't thought about that. He had been foolish. Too emotional. Maybe too proud. He had thought he was coming back for closure. To honor Margaret. To remind people what true horsemanship looked like. But somewhere along the way, he realized he wasn't just here for them. He was here for himself. At sunrise, George made a decision. He saddled Shadow, not for the auction, but to leave. Quietly. Before the questions turned into consequences. But as he reached for the reins, a voice came from behind him. "Running again, Lyman?" It was Ryan Burke, the young handler who had watched George with quiet admiration since the day before. He stood by the barn door, arms crossed, but his tone wasn't mocking. It was disappointed. George didn't answer right away. He looked down, then back at Shadow. "You don't understand, kid. This isn't just about horses. It's about people in suits who don't care what's right." Ryan stepped forward. "And what if people need to see what's right? What if that horse changes how someone treats the next one?" The question hit George harder than he expected. He had spent years hiding from the world's cruelty. But maybe, just maybe, he had forgotten that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to let it be seen, even if it costs you everything. The morning air was thick with anticipation. Word had spread beyond the auction grounds. Horsemen, journalists, and even a few outsiders had shown up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the black stallion and the man who disappeared. George didn't speak to anyone. He walked slowly toward the ring, Shadow trotting beside him with a grace that didn't belong to this world. There were no reins, no commands, just quiet understanding. Ryan trailed a few steps behind, helping to clear a path. Though still new to the scene, he had become fiercely loyal. He'd seen something in George, something real. "You don't have to do this," Ryan whispered one last time. But George just gave a small shake of the head. "Yes, I do." There was no ceremony in his voice. No drama. Just purpose. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They stood in still silence as the pair entered the arena. Shadow moved like poetry, every step controlled, every glance intentional. George didn't perform tricks. He simply let Shadow be what he was, present, powerful, and free. It was the kind of quiet performance that said more than words ever could. And something in the crowd shifted. Some began to cry. Others just stared, as if they were watching a memory they didn't know they'd lost. From the side of the arena, Dean Whitmore watched closely, phone in hand. His fingers hovered over a number he had promised not to call. But fear gripped him. Shadow wasn't just rare, he was impossible. A living echo of something that was never meant to see daylight again. If this went on, too many questions would be asked. Too many doors opened. Dean's career could be ruined. Or worse. And yet, even Dean couldn't deny what he was witnessing. He lowered the phone slowly, chest tight. That horse wasn't dangerous. He was pure. Maybe for the first time, Dean realized the real threat wasn't Shadow. It was the world that had tried to control him. And George? He wasn't reckless. He was brave. As the final step of the demonstration ended, George removed his hat, bowed slightly to the audience, and placed his hand over Shadow's heart. The crowd rose to their feet, not in wild applause, but in something far more powerful: respect. And for the first time in years, George didn't feel like a ghost among the living. He felt seen. The standing ovation still echoed in George's ears as he led Shadow back toward the barn. People were calling his name now, not in mockery, but with reverence. They wanted to know his story. Reporters waited by the fences, cameras flashing, questions flying. George ignored them all. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he knew was coming. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Inside the barn, Ryan was waiting, face pale. He held out George's phone. "You need to see this." On the screen was a government notice, an alert from a federal agency. Subject possibly identified. Breckenridge specimen Alpha, 13 confirmed. George stared at the screen. He didn't blink. They had found him. Shadow wasn't just a symbol anymore. He was a target. George sat down hard on a bale of hay, the wind knocked out of him. He had always known this day could come. That bringing Shadow into the public eye was a risk. But deep down, some part of him had believed that maybe, just maybe, the world had changed. He was wrong. And now the question wasn't whether they'd come. It was how fast. "I can help you get him out," Ryan said urgently. "There's a trailer behind the feed house. We can cut through the state road. They won't catch us." George looked up slowly. "And then what? Hide again? Spend the rest of our days looking over our shoulders?" His voice cracked. "That's not living. That's running." Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the grass. Footsteps echoed near the barn doors. Dean Whitmore appeared, this time not with a threat, but with a decision. "They're coming," he said softly. "But I can stall them. I have contacts. Maybe a day. Maybe two. But you need to decide what this really is, George. Is this just about protecting a horse? Or are you ready to fight for what he represents?" George looked at Shadow, who met his gaze with calm certainty. The same look Margaret once gave him before entering the ring for the last time. It wasn't fear. It was faith. A quiet, stubborn belief that doing the right thing was still worth the cost. And in that moment, George stood. Not as a man in hiding, but as a man who finally understood. Some things aren't meant to be saved in silence. They're meant to be defended, loudly, proudly, and without regret. The night fell heavy and quiet, like the calm before a storm. George stood alone outside the barn, watching the tree line beyond the pasture. Somewhere out there, men were coming. Not horsemen, not dreamers, but men with files, badges, and the power to take away everything he had left. Shadow stood beside him, unmoving, his black coat blending into the darkness. "They'll come at sunrise," Dean had warned. "You'll have to be ready." But George wasn't preparing to run. He was preparing to be seen again, one last time. That night, he made calls. To local journalists. To old friends. To people who had once believed in what horsemanship used to mean. He told them the truth, not about Shadow's origins, but about what he stood for. A bond. A trust. A promise that never broke, even when the world did. Word spread fast. By dawn, the fields outside the auction grounds were full. Not of agents, but of people. Riders. Breeders. Even strangers who had seen the footage online. They came not with signs or slogans, but with their horses. dozens of them, forming a quiet line near the fence, standing beside George, not because he asked, but because something in them recognized his fight as their own. From a black SUV at the edge of the gravel road, 2 federal agents stepped out. They were calm, professional, but clearly taken aback by the sight. "Mr. Lyman," one of them said, approaching slowly, "we need to speak with you about the Friesian. We have orders to take possession of the animal." George didn't flinch. He walked forward, hat in hand, voice steady. "You'll have to do it in front of all of them," he said, nodding toward the silent crowd. "And you'll have to explain why a horse that's never harmed a soul is being taken like a criminal." The agents hesitated. The older one looked around at the horses, the people, the cameras now filming from phones and drones. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a moment, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone present. "Sir, this isn't personal," the younger agent said. But George looked him in the eye. "It is to me." Shadow stepped forward without being led, stopping beside George with quiet grace. And in that instant, the scene was no longer about rules or ownership. It was about something much older, much deeper. A man and a horse who had survived the world's silence, and now stood to face its noise together. The sun broke over the horizon slowly, casting golden light across the grass, touching the black coat of the Friesian like fire on velvet. Shadow stood beside George as still as stone, his breath slow and calm. Around them, the crowd remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the federal agents seemed frozen, caught in a moment that didn't belong to protocol, but to something much older, honor. The older agent finally took off his sunglasses, letting his voice soften. "Mr. Lyman, this horse doesn't belong in a lab. Anyone can see that now." He turned to his partner. "We're not taking him. Not like this." The younger man hesitated but nodded. The decision wasn't written in a rule book. It was written in the faces of the people around them. In the way Shadow had looked at them. In the way George had never asked for applause, only truth. George blinked slowly, unsure if he believed what he'd just heard. After all the years of silence, the loss, the fear, he hadn't expected mercy. Shadow stepped closer to him, resting his heavy head against George's shoulder. And for the first time since Margaret died, George let the tears fall. Not out of grief, but relief. For the boy he used to be. For the woman he lost. For the horse he saved. For the man he became. Later that day, long after the crowd had dispersed, George stood alone in the ring. Ryan approached quietly, holding something in his hand. "They left this for you," he said. It was a certificate, handwritten, unofficial, but signed by everyone who had stood beside him that morning. "Honorary Steward of Horsemanship." George laughed under his breath, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see the day. But he had seen it. He had lived it. And as he looked across the fields, where young riders were now leading their own horses with new care, new eyes, he knew it was worth every scar. The world hadn't changed completely, but it had shifted. Just enough. And sometimes, that's all it takes. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills of Kentucky, George saddled Shadow one more time. Not to perform. Not to escape. But simply to ride. Through the fields. Toward the horizon. Not as a legend. Not as a rebel. But as a man who stood his ground, and reminded the world that some bonds are sacred, some stories must be told, and some spirits were born to run free.